Imagine, you're in London. The year? 1888. The city is alive. The pulse of the empire is at its height. Carriages rattle over cobblestones. Steam hisses from train engines. In the West End, theatres spill golden light onto the pavement. But far from the glamour, in the narrow lanes of the East End, the air feels heavier. The fog here does not drift. It clings. Whitechapel. A district of overcrowded lodging houses, gin shops and market stalls spilling into the street. In daylight, it is a place of desperate commerce and restless movement. But at night, it is a labyrinth, a maze of alleys where the light of a gas lamp can be swallowed whole within a dozen paces. Here, life is cheap. A penny buys you a bed in a common room, or a rope to lean against in the dark when you cannot afford to lie down. The smell of coal smoke mingles with rotting refuse. Footsteps echo in the mist, and every shadow seems to move when you're not looking. Most who walk these streets are fighting simply to see another morning. Poverty is the constant companion, disease a familiar face, and yet, in the autumn of 1888, something new creeps in alongside the chill of the season: fear. They would later say it began with a single woman found lifeless in a darkened street. But it did not end there. The killings came again and again, each one stranger, each one crueler, until finally a name was given to the phantom in the fog, a name scrawled in headlines and whispered in gin houses: Jack, the Ripper. More than a century later, his identity remains hidden, his footsteps long faded, and yet his shadow, that terrible shadow, has never left Whitechapel. Before we continue, if you enjoy this video, please take a moment and leave a like. If you want to see more content like this, feel free to subscribe. Any and all support is much appreciated. Chapter 1. Whitechapel, the hunting ground. By the late 19th century, London was a city of contrasts. In the West End, electric lights dazzled shop windows. Gentlemen in tailored coats strolled past the opera house. Ladies in silk parasols gathered for afternoon tea. The streets there smelled faintly of perfume, cigar smoke and horse leather. But step east, and the city changed. The streets narrowed, the buildings leaned inward, and the air thickened. This was the East End, a sprawl of working-class districts where life moved fast and death moved faster. Whitechapel lay at its heart. Here, over 80,000 souls were crammed into just a single square mile. The population swelled with immigrants fleeing famine, persecution, and poverty. Irish labourers, Jewish families from Eastern Europe, dock workers from across the empire, each searching for a foothold, each competing for scraps of work and shelter. The days were a blur of noise, costermongers hawking vegetables from handcarts, fishwives shouting the day's catch, the clang of blacksmiths hammering iron. At night, the chaos quieted, but it did not rest. After sundown, the gas lamps flickered to life, their yellow glow casting more shadow than light. In the alleys, men gathered at gin shops, their laughter turning to arguments before the hour was out. Women, some barely past girlhood, lingered at street corners, offering what they could in exchange for the price of a bed. A penny for the rope in the doss house. 2 pence for the luxury of lying down. The stench was overwhelming. Coal smoke poured from chimneys and mingled with the sour reek of refuse piled in gutters. Open drains carried waste along the cobbles. Rats moved freely, bold in their scavenging. Disease was everywhere. Cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, lingering like the damp in the walls. And yet there was life here. There was laughter in the pubs on market nights, and kindness in neighbours who shared what little they had. But there was also something else, something quieter, less tangible, woven into the fabric of these streets. Vulnerability. Whitechapel was a place where you could vanish. The alleys twisted into each other like a spider's web, their dead ends hidden behind warped wooden gates. A man could step from the light into darkness and be gone. In 1888, that vulnerability became a weapon. In the coming months, the narrow lanes of Whitechapel would witness a series of murders so shocking that the district's name would forever be tied to them. Murders that seemed to appear out of the mist itself and fade just as quickly. Chapter 2. The First Murder. Mary Ann Nichols. The first leaves of autumn had begun to fall over London in the last week of August, 1888. The air carried a damp chill that clung to the skin and seeped through the seams of worn coats. For many in Whitechapel, this was simply another night, another search for warmth, for shelter, for a few coins to last until morning. Among them was a woman named Mary Ann Nichols. She was 43 years old, though life in the East End had worn her face far beyond her years. Born in 1845, she had once been a wife and mother, living in the relative comfort of a brick cottage with her husband. But poverty is a patient predator. A failing marriage, a taste for drink, and the relentless grind of survival had stripped her of home, family, and stability. By that August, she was sleeping in common lodging houses, paying her keep one night at a time. On the evening of Thursday, August 30th, she left the Wilmot's lodging house on Thrall Street. She owed the keeper 4p for her bed and promised she would earn it before returning. Nichols told a friend, "See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." She had been drinking earlier and was in high spirits despite her circumstances. Her plan was simple: find a client, earn her lodging fee, and secure a night's rest indoors. The night passed in a haze of movement. Witnesses saw her on Whitechapel Road and later along Osborne Street. A constable on patrol remembered her swaying slightly as she walked, but she seemed in no distress. Sometime between 3 o'clock and 3:40 a.m., Mary Ann Nichols crossed into Bucks Row, a quiet, narrow street bordered by high brick walls and stable yards. Here the fog lay low, muffling the distant rumble of cartwheels. It was the sort of street where a whisper could vanish before it reached the next lamp. At around 3:40, a carman named Charles Cross made his way to work. His lantern light fell upon a dark shape lying on the pavement, just beyond the entrance to a stable yard. Thinking it was a tarpaulin, he stepped closer and realized it was a woman. Her eyes stared blankly toward the sky. Her hands were cold. A quick check found her breathing shallow, or perhaps not at all. Cross flagged down another passerby, Robert Paul, and together they agreed she might still be alive. In the dim light, neither man noticed the wound at her throat. They pulled her skirts down to cover her and hurried to find a constable. Constable John Neal arrived moments later. This time the lantern revealed what the others had missed. Her throat had been cut clean across, and her blood was pooling beneath her head. When the body was examined at the mortuary, the horror deepened. Nichols had suffered deep, deliberate slashes to the abdomen. The brutality was unlike the usual violence of Whitechapel streets. This was no drunken fight, no robbery gone wrong. Whoever had done this had worked quickly, silently, and with a strange kind of purpose. News of the killing spread by morning. The Star newspaper called it a revolting murder of a woman of the poorest class. Neighbors whispered of a maniac loose in the streets. The police, meanwhile, reassured the public that every effort was being made to find the killer. But in truth, they had nothing. No one had seen or heard the attack. The street, moments before empty, was now crowded with curious onlookers, their breath steaming in the chill air. And somewhere, perhaps only a few streets away, the killer walked calmly through the fog, leaving behind the first thread in a web of death that would soon entangle all of Whitechapel. Chapter 3. The Murder of Annie Chapman. The sun rose on Whitechapel Friday, September 7th, 1888, casting a weak light over streets that never truly rested. Just 1 week earlier, Mary Ann Nichols had been found butchered in Bucks Row. Fear had begun to cling to the air like the East End's constant dampness. The police presence was heavier now. Patrols walked more frequently, eyes scanning alleys, peering into shadows. But shadows are plentiful in Whitechapel, and the man they hunted moved through them as if they were his natural home. That night, Annie Chapman walked those same streets. Annie was 47, the daughter of a soldier, and had once lived a respectable life as a wife and mother. She and her husband had separated years earlier, and since his death in 1886, she had struggled to survive. In the East End, survival often meant doing whatever one could for a few coins, and for Annie, that often meant selling herself. In early September, her health was failing. She had a chronic lung condition, worsened by malnutrition and the relentless chill of London's nights. Yet on the evening of Friday, September 7th, she set out from her lodging house on Dorset Street, determined to earn the money for her bed. The price was 8p. She had only a few coppers. Around 1:35 a.m., she was seen outside the lodging house, telling the night watchman she wouldn't be long. She walked into the darkness. Several witnesses claimed to have seen her speaking with men, but whether any of them was her killer remains unknown. By 5:30 a.m., the narrow yard of 29 Hanbury Street was still, save for the occasional sound of horses from the nearby market. A tenant named John Davis stepped outside, intending to fetch water. He froze. On the ground near the back steps lay Annie Chapman. Her head was turned to one side, her eyes wide and glassy. Her clothing had been pulled up to her waist. Her throat cut deeply, twice, but the wounds did not end there. Whoever had done this had mutilated her abdomen with swift, brutal precision. Organs had been removed, not simply damaged, but taken. The act suggested more than random rage. It suggested intent and skill. The coroner's inquest would later note that the killer might have had a knowledge of anatomy, or at least a steady enough hand to work quickly in dim light. A neighbour, Mrs. Elizabeth Long, came forward to say she had seen Annie at about 5:30 a.m., speaking to a man just outside the house. She overheard Annie say, "Yes." When asked to describe the man, Long could only recall that he was shabby genteel in appearance, wearing a deerstalker hat and a dark overcoat. But the killer was gone. The yard was quiet again. Police searched the scene, finding a small piece of envelope, 2 pills and some leather apron shavings, enough to fuel gossip, but not to solve a murder. The press descended, the public growing restless. Theories began to spread. Was this the same killer who had murdered Mary Ann Nichols? The similarities were undeniable. The method, the time of night, the choice of victim. And if it was the same man, then he was not just a murderer. He was something darker. The name Jack the Ripper had not yet been spoken, but in the corners of Whitechapel, people began to whisper of a phantom who slipped between gaslit alleys, striking with surgical cruelty before melting into the fog. The second thread had been woven into his bloody tapestry, and it would not be the last. Chapter 4, The Double Event. September 30th, 1888. The East End slept restlessly that night. The autumn air was cold enough to bite, and a damp wind swept through the narrow streets. Whitechapel was still on edge from the murder of Annie Chapman just over 2 weeks earlier. The killer, whoever he was, had not been caught. But few imagined he would strike twice in one night. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride. Elizabeth was 45 years old, born in Sweden, and had been in London for over 2 decades. She spoke English with a Scandinavian accent and had once claimed her husband died in the tragic sinking of a steamer ship, though the truth of that was doubtful. She was known in the lodging houses and on the streets, often friendly, sometimes quarrelsome, but always carrying herself with a quiet dignity. On the night of September the 29th, she was seen in the company of several men, drinking at the Bricklayers Arms pub on Settle Street. Witnesses said she appeared cheerful. Later, just before 1 a.m., a labourer named Israel Schwartz spotted her on Berner Street, speaking to a man. Moments later, there was a scuffle. Schwartz crossed the street and walked away. He didn't intervene. At 1 a.m., Louis Diemschutz, the steward of the International Working Men's Educational Club, turned his pony cart into Dutfield's yard, just off Berner Street. The pony shied. Something was in the way. Diemschutz climbed down to investigate. His foot struck something soft. In the dim light, he saw her, Elizabeth Stride, lying on her side, her head turned, her throat cut in a single deep slash. There was no mutilation. Many believed the killer was interrupted. The Diemschutz's arrival had scared him away before he could complete his ritual. If that is true, then Jack the Ripper was still out there, still hunting. And he wasn't finished. Less than an hour later, he struck again. The second victim of the night was Catherine Edowers. Catherine was 46, a mother, and known for her quick wit and storytelling. That very evening, she had been arrested for public drunkenness and held in Bishopsgate Police Station. At 1 a.m., she was released. The constable on duty asked if she was able to take care of herself. "Oh yes," she replied with a smile. "Good night, old cock." At 1:35 a.m., she was seen walking toward Mitre Square, a dimly lit corner of the City of London. She was last spotted by Constable James Harvey at 1:45 a.m. At 1:44, another officer, Constable Edward Watkins, was patrolling the same area, but the square was empty. By 1:45, Catherine Edowers was dead. Her body was found in the darkest corner of the square. Her throat had been cut, her abdomen mutilated with a savagery even greater than before. The killer had removed her left kidney and part of her uterus, vanishing into the night with them. The speed was staggering. In less than 15 minutes, the Ripper had killed, mutilated, and escaped without being seen. Near the crime scene, detectives found a piece of Catherine's blood-stained apron. It had been discarded in a doorway on Goulston Street, almost half a mile away. Above it, written in chalk, was a cryptic message. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The meaning of the message has been debated for over a century. Was it a clue? A deliberate attempt to stir anti-Semitic tension? Or simply the graffiti of a passerby, unconnected to the crime? The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, feared a riot if the words were seen by the public. Before dawn, he ordered the writing erased. No photograph was taken. Whatever its meaning, it was lost forever. The double event shook London. 2 women dead within an hour of each other. The killer had shown he could evade the growing police net and strike at will. The press exploded with speculation. Letters poured in, claiming to be from the murderer. One of them, signed Jack the Ripper, would cement a name that still chills the spine. Whitechapel now lived in a state of near panic. Women avoided walking alone at night. The police patrolled harder than ever. But in the darkened alleys and the shifting fog, the Ripper moved unseen. And before the month was out, he would kill again. Chapter 5. Letters from Hell. As the autumn of 1888 deepened, the murders had become the heartbeat of the city's fear. A pulse that quickened with every new headline. Newspapers sold out within hours, their front pages dripping with speculation. In the pubs, in the market stalls, in the cramped tenements, people whispered about the killer who walked unseen. But now, the whispers took on a more chilling dimension. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received an envelope. Inside was a letter written in red inked ink scrawled in a hand that was strangely casual, almost playful. It began, "Dear Boss." The writer mocked the police for their failures, claiming the killings as his own work. He boasted that he would kill again and clip the lady's ears off for good measure. He signed the letter with a name the world would never forget: Jack the Ripper. At first, the police dismissed it as a hoax. Journalists and pranksters had been sending in false confessions since the first murder. But just 3 days later, on the night of the infamous double event, the killer did indeed mutilate one victim's face and cut a piece from her ear. It was enough to make investigators wonder, had this letter truly come from him? Then, on October 1st, another missive arrived. This one a postcard, written in the same hand and style, again taunting the authorities. The tone was gleeful, almost childlike, as though the murders were a game and the city itself a board upon which he played. But the most terrifying correspondence came soon after. On October 16th, George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small package. Inside was half a human kidney, preserved in wine. Accompanying it was a letter, written in an unsteady, almost drunken scrawl, which began, "From hell." The writer claimed to have eaten the other half of the organ before sending the remainder to Lusk. It was the kidney of Catherine Edders, he said, one of the victims of the double event. Medical examination confirmed the organ was indeed human, and from a woman of roughly Eddowes' age. For the public, these letters transformed the killer from a shadow into something almost theatrical. A murderer who not only took lives, but performed for his audience. For the police, they were both a possible breakthrough and a frustrating dead end. The handwriting gave no definitive clue. The red ink in the first letter proved to be simply red ink, and the Ripper, if it truly was he, never sent another organ. Yet the damage was done. The name Jack the Ripper was now branded into the public consciousness. The press repeated it relentlessly. Street ballads and penny dreadfuls picked it up. It was a name that turned fear into legend. The murders were bad enough, but the letters, whether authentic or the work of a clever imitator, made the whole affair feel like a macabre performance staged for an unwilling audience. And as the killings continued, London found itself trapped in a grim spectacle, where every act might be the last, or merely the prelude to something worse. Chapter 6. The Autumn of Terrors. The year was winding towards its close, but in Whitechapel the air was colder than the weather alone could explain. Fear had settled like a fog over the East End. Patrols were stepped up. Vigilance committees prowled the streets. But it wasn't enough. On the night of November 8th, 1888, Mary Jane Kelly was seen drinking in a pub near Spitalfields. She was young, just 25, and unlike the Ripper's earlier victims, she lived alone in a small single-room dwelling at 13 Miller's Court. Some said she had been trying to turn her life around. Others said she was drinking heavily that night, perhaps to forget the hard times that had brought her there. The last confirmed sighting of her alive came around 2 a.m., when a neighbor heard her singing softly in her room. The song was A Violet from Mother's Grave, a sentimental ballad about loss and longing. After that, silence. It was around 10:45 the next morning when her landlord's assistant came to collect overdue rent. He knocked. No answer. Through the grimy window pane, he saw what he thought was a bundle of rags on the bed. Then his eyes adjusted, and he staggered back. Inside, Mary Jane Kelly had been mutilated beyond recognition. The Ripper's previous killings were savage, but this was something else entirely. Every inch of her had been violated by the knife. The flesh of her face had been cut away, leaving only staring hollows. Her abdomen had been emptied, the organs arranged grotesquely beside her. Even her heart was missing. Police officers who had seen the worst of Whitechapel's crimes stood frozen at the threshold. Inspector Aberline himself admitted the scene was like nothing he had encountered before. The body was photographed, one of the earliest uses of crime scene photography in London, and even in those faded images, the horror bleeds through. Unlike the other murders, this one had been committed indoors. It gave the killer privacy and time. The ferocity suggested either uncontrollable rage or a deliberate attempt to send a final bloody message. But what was that message? Was Mary Jane Kelly chosen because she was young, or because she lived alone? Or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? In the days after the murder, police flooded Whitechapel. Suspects were hauled in. Tips poured into Scotland Yard, but nothing led to the Ripper. And then the killing stopped. Mary Jane Kelly's death marked the end of what the press had dubbed the Autumn of Terror. Whether the Ripper fled, died, was imprisoned for another crime, or simply chose to stop, no one knows. But her murder remains the most shocking in the case, not only for its brutality, but for what it seemed to symbolize, the climax of a nightmare that had held London in its grip for months. And yet, with the blood cleaned from the walls of Miller's Court, the questions remain. Had the killer's thirst finally been quenched, or had Jack the Ripper simply slipped into the shadows, waiting for the world to forget, before striking again? Chapter 7: The Suspects. The question that haunted London and the world was simple, yet maddeningly elusive. Who was Jack the Ripper? From the very beginning, Scotland Yard struggled to find answers. The killer's ability to evade capture baffled even the most seasoned detectives. Yet, from the fog and shadows, names began to emerge. Some whispered quietly, others screamed in sensational headlines, each claiming to be the murderer. Let us begin with Montague John Druitt, a man whose life and death have long captured imaginations. Druitt was a barrister from a respectable family, educated and articulate. In many ways, he seemed an unlikely suspect. Yet his story is tangled with tragedy. In late 1888, shortly after the last canonical murder, Druitt disappeared. His body was found in the River Thames weeks later, believed to have drowned himself. Some officers believed he was mentally unstable and saw him as a plausible suspect. But evidence was scarce, and many dismissed the theory as speculation born of grief and rumor. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel. Kosminski suffered from severe mental illness and was institutionalized not long after the murders ceased. His name appears in police memoranda, identifying him as a suspect. More recently, a controversial DNA study claimed a link between Kosminski and a piece of evidence found at one of the crime scenes. But forensic experts have raised questions about the reliability of this evidence and the integrity of the chain of custody. Still, Kosminski remains one of the strongest candidates in the eyes of many modern historians. Another figure early in the investigation was John Picer, a local bootmaker known as the Leather Apron. He was arrested on suspicion of the murders, but was quickly released due to an alibi. The nickname Leather Apron became a kind of urban legend in itself, symbolizing the fearful East End's suspicion of shadowy, dangerous characters lurking just out of sight. Whether Picer was innocent or guilty, the focus on him shows how easily fear and prejudice can shape an investigation. Beyond these, more obscure names emerged, like Dr. Thomas Neil Cream, a convicted poisoner with a penchant for violence. Some claimed Cream confessed to being the Ripper just before his execution, but records show he was imprisoned during the time of the murders, making it nearly impossible for him to be the killer. Yet the legend clings to him as an eerie footnote. Perhaps the most scandalous and sensational theory involved Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence. Rumours swirled that the grandson of Queen Victoria was involved in a royal cover-up, or even the killings themselves. Such stories were fueled by tabloid gossip, conspiracy theorists, and a public eager to find a villain in the corridors of power. Historians, however, reject this theory outright, citing lack of evidence and the prince's well-documented whereabouts during the murders. Still, the tale endures in popular culture. Moving forward in time, another suspect emerges not from the streets of Whitechapel, but from the art world. Walter Sickert, a painter fascinated by death and the macabre. In the late 20th century, crime novelist Patricia Cornwell reignited the case by accusing Sickert, claiming forensic evidence linked him to the murders. Skeptics argue that the evidence is circumstantial at best, but Sickert's haunting works and eccentric life continue to draw fascination and suspicion. These suspects reveal more than just possible killers. They reveal the anxieties and prejudices of Victorian London. Immigrants, the mentally ill, the poor, all were easy targets for suspicion in a city gripped by fear. Some historians suggest that Jack the Ripper may never have been a single individual. The killings attributed to him might have been the work of multiple perpetrators, or the result of media sensationalism combining unrelated crimes under one terrifying name. The hunt for Jack the Ripper exposed the social fractures of the time. The East End was a place of desperation and neglect, a place where victims could vanish without notice and where killers could slip through the cracks. It was also a place where the press and the police were desperate for answers, sometimes rushing to judgment or clinging to improbable suspects to quell public panic. And then there is the possibility that the true identity of Jack the Ripper will forever remain a mystery, lost to time, buried beneath layers of myth, misinformation and fading memories. The suspects, each cloaked in their own shadows, serve as mirrors reflecting Victorian society's darkest fears and failures. Whether it was Druitt's tragic despair, Kosminski's tormented mind, Pisa's scapegoating, or the wild claims of royalty and artists, the story of Jack the Ripper is as much about the world that created him as it is about the man himself. And so the legend endures, not just because of the murders, but because the truth remains out of reach, hidden in the fog of history and the fog of Whitechapel's gaslit streets. Chapter 8. The Legacy of Jack the Ripper. More than a century has passed since the terror of Whitechapel gripped London in 1888. Yet Jack the Ripper remains a name whispered with fascination and dread around the world. The murders changed more than just lives. They transformed how we think about crime, fear, and the media. Jack the Ripper was among the first killers to be sensationalized by a hungry press eager for headlines and readers. The case gave birth to modern true crime reporting, shaping a genre that still captivates millions today. In criminology, the Ripper case pushed early investigations toward more scientific methods, even if rudimentary by today's standards. It highlighted the challenges of policing sprawling cities, the limits of forensic science, and the importance of profiling suspects, a practice that remains crucial in solving crimes now. The East End itself, once synonymous with poverty and danger, has transformed dramatically. Yet the stories linger in its streets, in tours and museums, in films and books that keep the mystery alive. But beyond the headlines and myths lies a deeper truth. The victims were real women, with names, stories, and struggles. They were more than symbols or fodder for lurid tales. They were people lost to violence and neglect. As we remember Jack the Ripper, we also remember them. And in that remembrance, we find the true legacy of a mystery that endures, not simply as a story of horror, but as a reflection of a city, a society, and a human fascination with the dark corners of history. Jack the Ripper remains one of history's most enduring mysteries, an unknown shadow slipping through the fog of Victorian London. Though more than a century has passed, the case continues to captivate and haunt us, not just for the chilling crimes themselves, but for what they reveal about fear, society, and the darkness lurking beneath the surface of humanity. The identity of Jack the Ripper may never be known, but the stories, the victims, and the lessons from that grim autumn remind us why history matters, because every mystery holds a human story. If you found this journey into the past as gripping as I did, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious and stay safe.